if you run out of parquet, you can always use butter.
Cash for Christmas. That's the theme of the latest draw in the Kinwin Lottery for the physically handicapped. Yes, every day from now till Christmas, Kinwin is drawing 3 times a day for prizes of $200,000 to $100,000.
Today's Kinwin winners are Pat McDonald, Harrison Hot Springs, Rick Franner, Burnaby, and Elise Duer, Delta.
You can help the handicapped of all ages in BC by getting your Kinwin tickets now. And a Merry Christmas to you all.
Webster is next on BCTV.
Good morning. First, for the record, you'll recall that on Tuesday I gave you a report on a provincial court magistrate, Cyril J. Woodliff, who did not actually appear in court in Terrace. He was represented by his lawyer, but he was fined $350 and given the automatic 3-month license suspension for blowing over .08, a drinking and driving offense. In fact, he blew .12. And at that time, I pointed out that Judge Woodliff had been recently on leave of absence for health reasons. Today, I can tell you that Chief Judge Larry Goulet of the Judicial Council of BC has decided to order an inquiry into his conduct. And the statement from Goulet, given which I got from him this morning, is that an investigation into the conduct of Provincial Judge Woodliff in March and April of this year has been completed, and Goulet has decided to recommend to the Judicial Council that an inquiry be conducted. Goulet's statement says, "To the best of my knowledge, Judge Woodliff's conduct in the exercise of his judicial duties has been exemplary since that time, and for that reason, Chief Judge Goulet does not intend to suspend him pending the inquiry." The Judicial Council will be holding its next meeting on December the 22nd of this year. And this meeting had already been scheduled to conduct the routine business of the Council. Presumably, says Judge Goulet, the Council will then fix the time and place of the inquiry and decide as to whether the hearing will be in public or in private. And meanwhile, Judge Goulet, very properly, considers it inappropriate to comment further on the matter. So that's an inquiry to be conducted into Judge Woodliff's conduct. I just want to say my own little piece, very briefly, as I tend to do on occasions. With the number of inquiries into the conduct of judges in British Columbia, I think it should be said bluntly and in public that when the Judicial Council does meet, they should recommend and decide that the inquiry into the conduct of this particular judge be conducted in public. You know, especially judges, and in other provinces, it's almost automatically in public. And I sincerely trust that the Judicial Council of this province will not make the mistake of recommending a private inquiry, because especially with judges, justice must be seen to be done in public. Okay, that's that off my chest. Today is the day of the big blue machine in this studio. Prime Minister Bill Davis of Ontario, who's speaking in town today, is going to come on the program at about 9:45 and tell us what's wrong with the West, or what's right with the West, or what the troubles of Ontario are, and why he supports Pierre Trudeau in certain aspects of the Repatriation and, of course, in all the aspects, I suspect, of the energy policy. Bill Davis. That'll be the first time I've ever interviewed him, I think, and it'll be one of his first major appearances on the West Coast in recent years. But to fill in the time with humor, wit, and laughter prior to that is another of that strange breed of Canadian cat, Cat? Yeah, I suppose so. The political cartoonist. And this is a guy called Terry Mosher, who pronounces his name Aislin, not Aislin. And he's not a bully, this fellow. He's a bit of a wit. So we're going to chat up Aislin, who's flogging a book, of course. What would I do without the book floggers to fill space after the break? A moment of it. Terry Mosher is an excellent cartoonist, except the one I saw in the province this morning, I had to look at it a couple of times, and then I had to ask you to explain to me the significance of the cartoon. I haven't got this on a stand, but I'm going to use it anyway on camera number 2. Watch it. Let's have it. Say something in the meantime, while he's framing up.
It's a longhorn bull.
It's a longhorn bull.
Sure.
Is it a particularly specific longhorn bull?
A western one.
It's a western longhorn bull.
Yeah.
This is your view of the West.
Well, it's one view, one aspect. I mean, it's like a diamond. There are many facets.
I thought maybe you were another Easterner from Quebec coming out to cause trouble and alienation in this happy, settled
Not
part
at all.
of the land.
I've got a present for you from René Lévesque.
You what?
I have a present here for you from René Lévesque personally. It's a tie, Jack.
It's a tie. Oh, how delightful. Listen, is that the fleur-de-lis?
It certainly is.
The small fleur-de-lis? Is Bill Davis coming this morning?
That's right.
Can I take my microphone off?
You can do anything you want. It's your show.
Would you hold my microphone for a second?
Sure.
In my direction. Okay. You will now see a demonstration of the fastest typing on in the country. And what did Rennie say when he gave this to you for me?
I'll tell you later.
No, I want to know now. He said, give that to my good friend Webster,
That's right.
because he's a very nice guy. I just torn my jacket. How's that look?
Terrific.
Okay, I understand Nabet is now going to complain that you touched the equipment.
Now can we flog my book?
No, not yet.
All right.
I want to ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
Account for the fact that Canada has a plethora of talented cartoonists, and give me your opinions of some of them. Take, for instance, little Ben Wicks.
Oh, Ben is marvelous. I mean, he does these little things. I always maintain Ben draws as well with his left foot as he does with his right. But he proves the point that drawing is not the... some cartoonists use a great deal of technique, others use simple line like Ben does. I think it's more that the cartoonist has to have that cynicism, that inborn cynicism.
McPherson.
Marvelous fellow, the godfather of us all.
Peterson.
Tremendous technician, probably one of the best in the world in terms of technique.
Is he the most brutal?
Roy? Oh, he can be on occasion, but no, he's not the most brutal.
McPherson is.
I would say at times he has, but they all have been at different times. Remember, there's a tradition here of very strong political cartoons.
Len Norris.
No, Len is not brutal, but he's... Len Norris is I think the only thing that signifies in the East, BC, more than Len Norris is the totem pole. Whenever you think of BC, it's Len Norris cartoons.
You don't think of Bill Bennett?
No, Jack Webster is third.
Oh, so it's the totem pole, Len Norris, and Jack Webster.
That's right.
Let's have a look at some of Aislin's work, shall we? I'm not very good at this Johnny Carson type thing, but I'll try it. Okay. Now, there's a couple of good cartoons. Could you kindly explain the significance of the cartoon of the wording, "Did the Earth move"?
Trudeau has his arm benevolently around Lévesque, who's down to his T-shirt, and he's asking him if the Earth moved. It appeared the day after the referendum on the front page of the Gazette, the paper I worked for.
I get the significance of it.
Very good.
That's quite excellent. I'm pretty slow sometimes, as I was in the Western one this morning. Now, here is poor René Lévesque again with a tail pinned to him, smoking a cigarette from an inopportune vantage point.
A certain orifice. I had to negotiate with my editor how high or how low that cigarette should be. But anyway, we did get it in the paper. It was after Barre left Quebec, and Lévesque was trying very hard to have him do a Vive le Québec libre, as de Gaulle did. And he ended up with the proverbial tail on the donkey.
What does Lévesque think of you?
I think there's a certain respect on both sides.
Yeah, but the way you do him, you probably do him more brutally than anybody else in terms of his appearance. He looks like
Anyone who has a cause opens themselves up to this sort of thing. The more serious they take themselves, the easier it is to perhaps do a job on it.
Socially, he's still delightful, though, isn't he?
Always tremendous.
Tremendous man. Now, this you'll have to explain because it's difficult to read the writing.
After Joe Clark was elected, as you know, he had very few members from Quebec, so there's a classic little Tory figure approaching Yuppie, the Expo mascot, saying, we're seeking out potential cabinet material here in Quebec.
And about the only thing he could ever find would be the Expo mascot.
That's right.
That was willing to do anything for him. Ah!
This appeared the day after the Pope was elected, or however they get popes, and it shows him with the accordion and the papal gear, but with Polish piping. And this won the National Newspaper Award several years ago. A group in the States got in touch with me and wanted the original so they could present it to the man.
Present it to the Pope?
There he is. So there's my dumb little drawing hanging in the Vatican with Michelangelo and all the boys.
Pity you didn't get a chance to go and do it yourself and get blessed instead of cursed, didn't it, eh? What's that one?
Joe Clark.
No, that's not fair.
Sure it is.
Typical Eastern alienation, making a fool of a poor,
What are you talking
decent
about?
man.
The cartoonists in Alberta had a ball with him too. I mean,
Everybody has a ball with Joe. He's such a nice guy. That one.
Trudeau in his cabinet.
We'll let that sink in. Put it up again for a minute. Put Trudeau in his cabinet. Trudeau and a bunch of dogs. You don't actually...
Different pedigrees. SPCA. And
you don't actually identify them, do you? You don't want to pick out any particular people.
Sure. You want me to start
The
with...
Bulldog.
Well, you got McKechnie there and all kinds of people.
Who's the big St. Bernard?
Oh, that's some backbencher. I forget his name.
Forget his name. And there we are with the earth
We've
moving
been through
again.
that.
Terrific. Do you do a book a year?
No, I do a book when I feel I have a book. I don't... you're drawing all the time. You have good periods, you have bad periods. It's like anything else. And when I feel I have 150 to 200 cartoons that are suitable for a book, I put one together.
Output. I remember in the early days when Norris came out and I was working at the Vancouver Sun, when he used to come up with 3 or 4 ideas a day, and I think it was Cliff McKay.
That's the way Len likes to work. He likes input from his editors. Other people
Right.
don't. So Len is like that, and it's like anything else. You have to find your own level. I'm good for about 200 to 250 cartoons a year, 100 of which perhaps maybe.
It's a hell of a pressure now. For instance, what have you got in your mind for tomorrow? It's already done.
Yeah, actually, it's a little fellow, and he's talking about the roots of contemporary nationalism in Quebec. Mm-hmm. And he traces back through the rebellions of 1837 right to the Plains of Abraham, 1759. In the second panel, he's talking about the roots of nationalism or Western separatism, and he traces it right back to the beginning of the beer strike in July in Alberta.
Good. Going to do some more with Terry. I'm always going to say Terry Aislin, Terry Mosher. Why Aislin?
It's my daughter's name.
Oh, it's a real name.
Yeah.
So you chose that name for your cartooning career?
That's right.
Odd, isn't it?
I'll tell you about it after.
Tell me about it after the break. Why does a famous syndicated cartoonist called Mosher call his book Aislin? Give himself the professional career title of Aislin?
I suppose it hurt him a coward.
And, you didn't want to use your own name, so you inflicted your daughter's name on your career, eh?
That's right.
Just as simple as that.
No, it started out as a joke. In the old days when I was going to art school in Quebec City, I used to work the tourists in the street, you know, the little streets they have. And I drew portraits of kids from Cincinnati and that sort of thing with a phony French accent. And when my daughter was born, I was delighted about this whole thing, so I began signing these portraits and caricatures with her name, just for the hell of it, really. And then some guy from a magazine came along and bought one of these things and published it and sent me a check for $50, and I thought there might be something in this, and I've been doing it ever since.
That's really how you got into it?
Yeah.
Because you didn't intend to be a cartoonist, you intended to be...
I thought to be a political cartoonist, you had to have a master's degree in political science or something like that. And it was only later I discovered that these people are human beings just like everyone else. They've dealt with situations like having to pay the rent, this, that, and the other, and that is far more important in terms of developing attitudes about politicians than some master's degree.
But yet, at the same time, you've got to keep closely in touch with the political feeling of the ordinary person, so you do that.
Yeah, you get a lot more information sitting in taverns than you do sitting in the House of Commons.
Is that why you spend so much time in taverns?
You're damn right. That's the only reason.
Tell me, do you ever do any confrontations with politicians?
Every day in the newspaper. Other than that, I avoid them like the plague.
Lovely. You can just sit back, think your sneaky thoughts, do your cruel drawings, and they are cruel, I suppose, in some way, and you don't even have to say hello or shake hands with them.
And they pay me for it.
They pay you for it. Who actually discovered you? I mean, you're syndicated in 40 papers across the country now. So where did you start?
I've always been Montreal-based, and I sort of played ping-pong with the Montreal Star and the Gazette. I'd move back and forth. Now we only have the Gazette left, so I guess I'm stuck there.
We're lucky. You're going to be lucky if you have 4 newspapers by the end of the century if you're still around doing cartoons.
Well, that's when we take over TV.
But cartoons are good now and again, but the trouble is they don't talk.
They can.
Little balloons on them.
No, you do voiceovers and so on. This is a problem with television. You know, they haven't developed satire to any degree at all, and they're going to have to start thinking about it.
And it's very difficult to tell jokes on television, too, because you can't hear the people laughing.
True.
If the crew laughs, you know that you've made a raunchy remark. But they never laugh at anything of mine that passes for humour.
Can I take over your show here?
Sure.
I want to plug another book. It's I think it's a good idea.
Name
Oh,
of
no.
Lord Harry. But feel free, Terry. feel
Okay.
free.
There's so many good cartoonists in this country. You mentioned that before. An outfit in Toronto have put out the first annual collection of all political cartoons, the best political cartoons. It's called The Art of Political Cartooning. That'll be coming out every year. Do I hold this up?
Yeah, hold it up. Do your best.
All right.
You wanted to be on television. You're
Okay,
on
and I'm
television.
not even making any money out of this. All right, where? Okay, there
Not
we go.
behind the coffee cup. Tip it forward a little bit.
There we go.
See?
Okay.
The Art of Political Cartooning.
Yeah.
Whose cartoon is in the front?
Ed Ulashak. It won the National Newspaper Award this
Well,
year.
let me see that one. I never heard
But
of
here's
it. Why haven't I
here's a
heard of it?
bonus for those people out there that want a terrific Christmas present. All your BC cartoonists, Len Norris, Roy Peterson, Bob Bierman's coming over, Adrian Rayside, you name them, they'll be there. Kerry Waghorn, Ed Ulashak's coming in from Edmonton. They're all going to be signing books at Eaton's tomorrow between 1 and 2.
All of them?
Yeah, and I'm going to be signing my book, and they're going to be signing that book, and so on. And then if they have any of their books around.
Oh, just remind me about Bierman. It was Bierman that got nailed by the Supreme Court here on that famous tearing the wings off a fly
Well, that's
involving Willie Woodenshoes, Bill Vanderzam. That must have given you cartoonist heart failure.
I knew what Vanderzam was up to when I drew a cartoon almost immediately after of him tearing legs off frogs, and I got a note back saying he loved the cartoon. What Vanderzam did there was every newspaper in the country spelled his name right.
You haven't got the legs off the frogs here, have you?
No.
Pity. So you did.
Oh, it is in there.
Is in here. So you did one immediately after the judgment, before the appeal.
That's right.
It's too small to see. Tearing the legs off frogs.
Yeah. Well, you remember you made racist statements in Edmonton or whatever it was. Yeah.
What do you mean racist statements? These are normal British Columbia social credit politician statements. You've got to get your... who's going to take it? Anybody? Yeah.
That was the Bierman cartoon that he was sued over.
That was the one he was sued over?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
He lost the initial decision, but your BC, the Supreme Court here, they must have 1 or 2 civilized individuals in there because they turned it around.
Yeah, it was pretty certain they were going to turn it around in any case. Now, what about the political situation as far as you're concerned?
Where?
Here in the West. Do you believe Trudeau or do you believe...
Well, I hear that a lot of my friends are very nervous about the political situation here, and they're moving back to Quebec.
Right. And how about life in Quebec, though? Montreal?
It's very quiet these days. It hasn't gone away. I think it's just hibernation. Its head hasn't gone away. It's all.
That was a beautiful one we showed of you on the bumper there with Claude Ryan. Does he frighten you more than René Lévesque does?
He's far more authoritarian figure. I'm not frightened. Actually, it's like this. Richard Nixon was a gift to political cartoonists, and we hated to see him go. We thrive on this sort of thing. We're like vultures in a way. So the worse it is, the better it is for us. If everything was terrific and bland and nice and so on.
And handsome.
Yeah, we would be I'd be driving a truck or stealing one.
Yeah. It's not silly to ask you your favorite choices because you could take anyone's visage and make it foul, can't you?
I can certainly work at it, yeah.
What are you working at there?
All right. You've got Bill Davis coming on?
I've got Bill Davis coming on this morning.
All right, this is inside the book. I want you to have that. Ordinarily, I got a lot of dough for this. You realize it?
You mean I would have to pay for this?
Yeah, cash.
I'm not going to show this. I'm not going to show this. Which camera? Oh, name. I get it. Put the camera up high so it looks thinner. You see? In close. There we are. That's Webster.
Saying, and now for my next trick.
Bill Davis.
As a balloon, very bland balloon.
That is brutal. That really is brutal. Well, that's magnificent. When did you do that?
Huh?
When
What do you
did
do? I just did it up now.
Just did it up right now.
Just like that.
Just like Ben Wicks, with,
Sure.
with a little more detail, eh?
That's right.
Well, I'm indeed touched and honored. Wonder if anybody wants to talk to you on the phone. You ever speak on the phone on a TV
Sure.
show? You have?
Yeah.
Does anybody call?
Oh, God, I don't know. Yeah, oh, yeah, you get calls, but I remember I'm not a local boy, so
No, you're a Montreal
if
kid.
it was Len Norris, the thing would be, you know.
Yeah, but we'll try you.
Sure, okay.
I hope you don't get any calls at all. No, you'll get lots of calls. The art of being a political...
Roy Peterson will call. Threaten me to a duel or something.
He will do. The art of political cartooning, because Bill Davis will be here shortly. But let's have a little chat up on the phones to Terry this morning. He likes Lévesque. You admire Bill Davis? You admire Bill Davis?
I think the best cartoon I ever did of Bill Davis was like an election poster, and they were having an election, and there's this bland face, and the line was, Ontario, vote for Davis, you deserve one another.
But he's clever. He's shrewd. He's tough.
Yes, of course. He's a politician.
And he's still in power.
He's a politician.
And you wouldn't say he's charismatic like with Pierre, would you?
No, but that blindness can even work like a Jerry Ford after Nixon was. Half the cartoonists in the United States were going to commit suicide. But Jerry Ford fell down a few times, bumped his head, and then they had something to go with. Davis, it's the same thing. McPherson does a marvelous Bill Davis. I mean, he owns him. You know.
Where do you get your hair done?
In the shower this morning.
Magnificent head of hair. How old are you, 45?
72.
72.
Yeah.
Calls to Terry Mosher. Aislin.
Aislin, en Québec.
Aislin.
En Québec, ouais.
En Québec. After the break. Well, you seem a pleasant kind of guy. How old are you, really? You've only been in the business since, when, 67?
67. I'm 38.
That was when you were discovered peddling cartoons on the streets of...
On the streets of Quebec City.
Quebec City.
Yeah. René Lévesque gave me my first start.
He did, really?
He said, I'm going to make you famous, kid.
And he did, didn't he? In effect, he did.
Yeah.
Go ahead to Aislin.
Jack?
Yeah.
Before you start on Aislin, I have one other thing. You mentioned about the judge and about the fact that he didn't have to appear in court, and he appeared by agent.
That's right.
What concerns me is, with your sources of information, you should know more. You should have checked that out a little more closely.
I did check it out.
Well, as a lawyer, I'll tell you, lots of people appear by agent. I go to court a lot of times. The only time you want to take somebody in when you're pleading guilty is when you're looking for a lot of sympathy from the judge.
I'll tell you that as a matter of practice in the lower mainland and courts of British Columbia, It is most unusual for a person on a criminal code drinking offence not to appear in person in court. It is the regular and general practice.
The only time you have somebody come in on something like that is when you're looking for sympathy and you want them to stand up and look contrite in front of the judge so the judge will reduce the sentence. When you're going in with somebody who's going to get a pretty standard sentence, which is what that judge got.
This country is being made very conscious of drinking and driving offences. When a judge of the provincial court faces such an offence, to me it is not acceptable that the judge, although I realise that the presiding judge has discretion in this matter, if it is dealt with summarily and not by indictment, and I think you will find that most legal authorities of the Crown in British Columbia will agree with me entirely.
Well, most drinking driving, most impaired driving cases are dealt with.
Well, don't tell me that people who blow more than .12 don't have to appear in court, because when you don't have to appear in court, you reduce very sharply the impact of the conviction.
The fact of the matter is you don't have to appear in court, and I've never...
The practice is that you do appear in court on these charges.
I've never seen a drinking driving case, a simple impaired, dealt with any way but summarily. They don't generally...
I know that, but you will find that 99 out of 100 appear in court.
They don't have to.
I know there's a technicality in the law, but that's not...
Technicality, it's a very simple fact. It's the same as
know,
having a dog running a barge
know.
or any of the summary conviction offenses.
How long have you been practicing? 5 minutes?
No, about 10 years. You know me.
Oh, I do. Well, I'll deal with you the next time I see
we
you.
had a fast drive one day up to North Vancouver together.
I remember. Oh, it's you, is it? I thought you were out of the practice of law and into the development business.
Not quite, Jack.
Okay, anything for Terry?
Pardon?
Anything for Aislin?
Yes. Who does he think is the most rewarding political figure to draw in Canada these days? Would it be Whalen?
Well, who is Whalen Jennings?
Whalen.
Oh, Eugene
Whalen.
God.
In Whale.
The most rewarding figure of the last few years, you have to name, they have to be an entry. You're talking about Pierre Trudeau and René Lévesque because of the classic confrontation. Claude Ryan is a comer. No one has really surfaced on this Western separatism thing yet because we don't know if it's just a powder puff or if it's going somewhere, but we'll see.
Who's got the best features? Who's got the features?
Oh, everybody has the best features. You just go with what you've got.
Oh,
I mean,
no.
Joe Clark, any number
Is
of them.
that up now? This is for the benefit of my caller. Can I see that again,
this
please?
is my opinion on lawyers. The fellow there with the noose, the fellow saying to him, it's your lawyer returning your call, collect.
Your lawyer is returning your call, collect. The man is on the gallows, and the guard has brought over a telephone.
Well, obviously he's an influential enough lawyer to be
I
able to
hope
get through
you
the
get
system.
the message. Thanks very much, Jay.
You're welcome, Jack.
Much obliged, Jay.
They tell me that there are really some nice, decent lawyers out there. Maybe I'll meet one some of these days.
Don't be so cynical. Really, but he's full of
They
wind.
make too much money.
That guy's absolutely full of wind. I know him, and I can confirm he's full of wind. Go ahead, please.
Jack, will you ask Aislin what the devil this cartoon in the province this morning is all about?
I asked him, and he's going to tell you again.
It's a longhorn bull. It's a Western separatist, and the ring around his head is oil barrels. And his belt buckle, if you look closely, it says freeze.
I see that.
Can you see it now?
You know, about something about us
It was
Eastern...
a post-mortem on Billy Carter.
No, something about us Eastern bastards freezing in the dark and all that stuff.
I thought it was Bill Davis. But now I get the significance. We in the West are a little bit slow.
Looks more
as
like
you know.
you, Jack.
More like me,
I
thanks very
thought-
much.
I thought it was laid back.
Go ahead to Teddy.
Yes, Jack, it's refreshing to see that you've got Aislin on there this morning. I'd like to give him a retainer from the Western Canada Federation because we're going to have some interesting times here early in the new year. I wonder what he charged to give us a straight retainer.
What, he wants to
He
buy me out?
He wants you to become a cartoonist consultant for a group of slightly hairy separatists.
$400,000 a year in a boat in Bermuda.
It sounds fair. Of course, whether Jack considers we're hairy or not, only time will tell. I enjoy everything you draw, and I'm also of the opinion that cartooning will never die, and it's the saving grace of the British parliamentary system.
Thank you, you're right.
Who was the first one?
The first cartoonist?
Yeah.
I suppose some guy who was doing some scrawls on the wall. But the first
Name
real
cartoonist.
Gilroy.
Well, remember when we were kids, Jack, we used to read Punch, and you've enjoyed it if you get a hold of it even yet.
Good, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Where's the next call, Gladys?
Beg your pardon?
Oh, I've done that one. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Terry, could you tell
Yeah.
me if there's any place where I could get a collection of Nixon cartoons?
There was a... Wait a minute, I'm trying to remember. Either there is one out or one is coming out. God, ask at a bookstore. It rings a bell. There is something. But off the top, I can't remember. There's so many cartoon books coming out these days. We're getting popular.
I mean, the guy must have some form of paranoia if he wants a collection of Nixon cartoons.
No, it was a magic period for cartooning. He said, this is the thing you don't understand. We thrive on that stuff. Things like wars and...
Watergate.
Vietnam was a gift for us.
Vietnam. Oh, separation. We don't quite have the kind of excitement politically that they have in other countries, do we?
Well, I think in Alberta, everybody's a millionaire as a separatist, and they just don't want their money taken away. I don't know about here in BC.
Not too bad. Go ahead, please. From Salt Spring Island.
Good morning, Mr. Aislin.
Good morning.
Mr. Webster.
Morning.
I would like to express my appreciation for some humor on the political scene. If ever there was humor needed, it is now. I feel, too, that it would be rather nice to have Mr. Aislin's talent used here in British Columbia. I think we have some of the most comical figures in politics here in the history of Canada.
Thank you very much, but you have two of the best cartoonists in the world working right here right now, in Roy Peterson and Len Norris.
Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that John? Oh, hi. Hello, Mr. Mosher.
Yes.
I think you're fantastic. And after Levesque, do you know who I would really like to see you do? Is Mr. McQuiggan.
Who?
Mr. McQuiggan?
Who?
Mr. McQuiggan.
Oh, McGuigan.
Oh, McGuigan.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean the Foreign Affairs Minister?
Right.
We're just sharpening our pencil on him.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, Terry, I'm going to let you go now. I have a couple of things to do before Premier Bill Davis gets in. He should be here any minute. And I shall let him look at the original cartoon you did, and I shall invite people to go to Eaton's. When is it?
Tomorrow, I think it's 1 to 2, and you'll have Bob Bierman, another great cartoonist, over, the fellow from the trial, Len Norris, Roy Peterson, on
and the great Aislin.
Yeah, but I'll be signing my book, not their book.
I know, but you're helping them by plugging them. And thank you very much for this. I shall treasure it. My wife will tear it up, but I shall treasure it.
Thank you.
Back with Premier Davis after the break. Premier Bill Davis is in the studio now, and I'm really quite looking forward to this morning. And before he comes into the studio for makeup, I got to tell you, I don't quite know which way to tackle him. With Trudeau, you know what you're doing, straight up. He never answers any questions, but at least you try the questions. I have not, I think, except once briefly at a press conference in Vancouver many, many years ago, and as my memory tells me, I'm almost convinced, I'll check with Premier Davis himself, that he and Lougheed were together in a salon on the Hotel Vancouver discussing some matter of great import at that particular time, but what it was now I cannot remember. We all know the broad situation in respect to the situation on unilateral repatriation of the Constitution. And this morning at his press conference, Prime Minister Trudeau reaffirmed that he's not going to abandon his July the 1st date for the unilateral repatriation of the Constitution. So to Premier Davis this morning, I'm going to find out exactly where he stands on the Constitution, on the repatriation, and where he stands on the Bill of Rights. I do know, for instance, that he is very solidly against, it would seem, the enfranchisement of the language in the legislature and courts of Ontario. I'm going to take a break now and come back with Premier Davis. Premier Davis has been the top man in Ontario since 1971. He's now in his second session of a minority government and seems to be surviving remarkably well. What people in the West would like to know is how far will he go in supporting Prime Minister Trudeau's energy policy and unilateral repatriation with a Bill of Rights. Sir.
Why do you start off with such a non-provocative introduction?
Well, it's my way of life, but quite seriously, you are painted in the West as the man, and you'll hit me for this, who is in bed with Trudeau except in bilingualism, and you are painted as the big blue machine, which is now a have-not province, and jealous of the economic part of the West. Do you truly feel like that?
No, I think if that is how I am portrayed, the portrait painters have exercised a degree of artistic license that Jack is not supportable. I've heard the phrase being in bed. I know you have to be very careful on your program with the Prime Minister of Canada. That is not historically correct. It was not too far distant, really, from where we are now geographically in 1971, when Ontario took a position, incidentally supported by every other province in Canada, which position hasn't really changed 10 years later. Our position on constitutional change has been consistent. It has been, I think, relatively logical. And the fact that it has remained consistent, and some people then portray this as being in support of Mr. Trudeau or the government of Canada, is not historically correct. I could make as valid an argument to these portrait painters that if they wanted to do it accurately, that in fact the government of Canada has moved closer on some of these issues to our point of view than we have to theirs.
Now, you're talking, of course, about the Victoria Consensus in 1971.
That's right, where all provinces agreed. And then, of course, the province of Quebec, for its own reasons, the then Premier left the conference in support. Some few days later altered it, and it's very regrettable. I mean, the debates we're presently having, if we had finalized things in 71, Jack, some of these issues at least would have been dealt with.
Let's forget energy for a moment and ask you about unilateral patriation. Do you support the unilateral patriation now on the same grounds as Trudeau has, in that it is now impossible to get unanimous agreement among the provincial premiers?
Well, Jack, I think you have to look once again at not only history, but fairly recent history. Ontario, and I would remind some of your viewers, particularly here in the West, that Ontario was the province that called nearly 2 years ago now, not quite, for patriation alone. I was at that first ministers' meeting. We were making some progress, but it broke down for a variety of reasons, and I'm not being critical of that. So I said, let's have patriation, then settle some of these issues when they come home. I got no support for that around the table, and it's encouraging now to see other premiers who, some 2 years later, are suggesting this as a solution. We went to that conference in the fall. We went there prepared to, in fact, had supported a number of provincial initiatives. We were supportive of some of the concern expressed by the Premier of this province in terms of greater involvement in the federal institutions, the questions of the Senate. We were supportive of all of those things, but the conference, unfortunately, didn't achieve a consensus. And so the position then becomes very simple. If, in fact, we're to have patriation, if one, and I prefer unanimity, there'd be no one happier in this country if all of us were agreeing on this, but the reality is that that hasn't happened. I mean, you have the Premier of Quebec, and I'm not, once again, going to get into any personal debates. I'm not accusing anybody of being in bed with anybody. We don't do that in our province. But Mr. Levesque has made it clear. Well, now, don't misunderstand me. Mr. Levesque has made it quite clear that he is not in support of patriation, period.
Mr. Davis.
So how can you get unanimity?
Mr. Davis, you are a superb politician. I've had the same kind of talk with different nuances from every provincial premier I've spoken to. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, at this moment, support Pierre Trudeau in the unilateral repatriation from Britain of his Constitution Act, his Constitution Bill, as it now stands?
We, and I said this the day after he made his announcement, that Ontario was in support of the substance of the resolution before the House of Commons, which has now been referred to the Joint Committee. We are in support of equalization, we're in support of mobility of labor, we're in support of the entrenchment of the, in quotes, Bill of Rights. These have been positions that have been totally consistent for the last over 10 years.
Is there anything in his bill which would prevent you from supporting it in the final crunch? For instance, the bilingualism entrenched, perhaps leading towards bilingualism.
But it's not in the bill. It's not in the bill.
Do you fear it?
No, I don't fear it, because our understanding is that the resolution as presently before the Joint Committee is what the Government of Canada is committed to. We came up with a compromise that we think really solves the problem, and that was the entrenchment in the Constitution, which is a principle I don't think anybody can take exception to, of the right to an education in either of the two official languages of Canada where the numbers warrant, which is incidentally the law in the province of Ontario at this moment.
But who suggested, was it, that bilingualism should come to the courts and the legislature in Ontario?
That's section 133 that is in the present act, which has application to...
It was Claude Ryan who said that should be applied.
No, Claude isn't the only one. There have been people over the years who suggest this should be applied to the province of Ontario. Our position, Jack, has been very simple. We, in fact, are moving in the courts. You now can have criminal trials in French in the province of Ontario. We are moving in the hospital systems. We, in fact, are translating some of our statutes. It is possible for a member of our legislature to speak in French in the House. What we are saying is that we're doing it in a way that is acceptable to the people of the province of Ontario, is satisfying the concerns of the Francophones who incidentally appeared before the committee, supported the approach that we're taking, and that we were not in support of having this entrenched within the Constitution within the provincial domain. National institutions, no quarrel.
Mm-hmm. You therefore do support Trudeau's Bill of Rights, Constitution Act as it now stands?
Yeah, I would like to see, and we've made some suggestions, and he's accepted one of them, with respect to the amending formula. The amending formula, in my view, is very important, and we suggested 2 or 3 refinements to it. One I think will be acceptable. I think there's still room for further discussion on amending formulas.
Does the amending formula give Ontario and Quebec, even if they don't in the future have 25% of the population, a permanent veto on constitutional change?
Well, I think if you say they don't have that percentage of the population, it does relate to population. That is one of the considerations in the amending formula. I think for any effective purposes over a period of years, like the Victoria Charter, which gave, in quotes, Ontario and Quebec a right of veto. But you get around then to the concept of the referendum, which I think people are perhaps a little uncomfortable with. And I guess the answer to the referendum is, what other mechanisms do you have to break a deadlock? And you've had one instance. I've not used this example too many occasions, because some people who are critics of the amending formula say it is bypassing the provincial legislatures. And that is to a certain extent true. It's not as clear-cut as that. But in fact, you've had one referendum in Canada in recent history. My view is that if the legislators in the Quebec Assembly in fact wish to express what was their stated public policy of sovereignty association, those legislators might in fact have tried to enact it. Now, they had no legal way of doing it, so the referendum came into effect, and it was the people who determined they didn't want sovereignty association.
Are you prepared to accept a change in the amending formula which does not give Ontario or Quebec vetoes?
Well, Jack, I don't know how you can have an amending formula that, no matter how you construe it, would not give Ontario or Quebec a form of veto, whether it's done by way of referendums or numbers. I think the issue is whether or not an amending formula can be developed which would give, say, 2 or 3 other provinces combined, in quotes, a right of veto. I think that really you can't single out Quebec and Ontario not having it. I think that we had the Toronto Consensus, which actually, as I recall it, gave, say, the province of Alberta the right of veto over a constitutional amendment that would affect the resource sector. This was their concern at that time. Now, that concern has been translated into other areas of provincial jurisdiction. So I don't think you're going at it the wrong way.
But you do get the point that Western premiers and observers in the West say, hey, Ontario and Quebec are first-class provinces because they have solitary vetoes. The West and the other part are second-class provinces because they only have combined vetoes.
Yeah, but Jack, it is a question of numbers of people. And I don't think you can ignore the principle that if there are 8 million people in the province of Ontario and there are 180,000 people in the province, say, of Prince Edward Island, and I don't want to be misunderstood here, but I think you can't say that in terms of a constitutional amendment that have national impact, I think you have to weigh that very carefully.
More with Premier Davis of Ontario after the break. Mr. Davis is the Premier of Ontario, as well you know. Mr. Davis, how true are the reports of doom and gloom in Ontario? 20% unemployment in certain areas. You're now a have-not province, but you have proudly refused to accept equalization payments. Was that out of sheer pride? How does it feel, Mr. Davis, to be a have-not province for the first time in history?
Well, Jackie, I really don't think we are a have-not province, and it's not out of pride. Actually, our unemployment figure is around 7.3, which is somewhat lower than the national average. We have economic difficulties in the province of Ontario. No one is minimizing them. We're impacted by the downturn in the automotive sector, because the automotive sector is, what, 24% of the economy of the province of Ontario, and that is now starting to improve, but it will depend to a great extent on the market conditions in the United States. We made it clear that we were not going to accept equalization at this moment in history, because to say that Ontario is entitled to equalization with the still relative wealth we have and the relative economic strength, to me would be a contradiction of what this country is all about. It was not pride, it was nothing else other than a simple statement of fact. If our financial system was such that Ontario was at this moment entitled to equalization, then there had to be something fundamentally wrong with the formula.
Many people, though, in the West, though, got quite irate when you attacked Clark's budget with his 18-cent excise tax and feel that it was your sheer economic position that forced you to go against the Clark government and perhaps help bring it down.
Well, Jack, some people will suggest this, but at the same time I would say to any of those people, I doubt that any of them worked any harder to see if we couldn't get Joe Clark reelected in February. We objected to the 18 cents excise tax for two reasons. And we objected to the 10 cents. You recall the former government that put on the 10-cent excise tax. We objected strenuously to that. So did some other premiers, because that is a tax field ordinarily occupied by the province. It is a direct tax per gallon or per liter. We objected to the 18 cents. We said it was too high. We objected to it, and it wasn't anything that we had not done with the previous budget. I can't measure for you to what extent that criticism of that item of the budget had on any political outcome. I can tell you, sometimes the media ignores these things, never yourself. We were very supportive of many aspects of Mr. Crosby's budget. Now, that didn't receive the same prominence as the criticism, I understand.
But why should the West, why should Lougheed, a good conservative like yourself in the West, not be able now to take full advantage of this burgeoning wealth without having an effect to subsidize Ontario industry, putting it very crudely?
Well, I guess, Jack, you ask yourself really, what is the nature of this country? One could have argued this some years ago. What obligation was there on the Ontario manufacturing base, which is not there just by an accident of history, created with a certain amount of hard work by Ontarians, a certain amount of investment. Why should that tax base be used for equalization across the rest of the country? And I tell you why. This country wouldn't function without it. And Ontarians have never objected to the principle of equalization. What is the difficulty in this whole situation is that by the Constitution, resources are under provincial ownership. Manufacturing sector being a more nebulous sort of situation, it is not under our ownership, but it is one of our sources of wealth in the province of Ontario, and we have shared that wealth through taxes to the central government for the other parts of Canada, and this country wouldn't exist today if that weren't a principle.
So now you want Alberta to take the same unselfish, sharing is caring attitude and agree to keep the prices of oil down to a level which you can absorb in your industry?
No, what we are saying very simply is, and the Premier of Alberta, and I give him full credit, has agreed with the principle that the price should be a percentage figure, whether it's 20 or 25, below Chicago or world price. We have agreed to an increase staged to accommodate this. We have argued for a period of time to do it, and one can always argue what the length of time is. Ontario has never argued for cheap energy prices. You compare what we were paying in '74 to what we're paying in 1980, and you can't argue that compared to many other areas, it is cheap. What we are also arguing, though, and I think it is fundamental to the country, is the whole concept of distribution. I'm not looking for subsidies. What I am looking for is some objective assessment to see where resource revenues fit into the overall federal, provincial, financial arrangements as it relates to the total country. That's what we're looking for.
But you can understand why Alberta feels quite strongly that it is subsidizing Ontario and Eastern industry.
No question. I understand that perception. I would also point out, though, that it is sometimes a two-way street. I'm not going to try to equate it in dollar terms because you could never come close. But for a period of time, because of national policy, we were in Ontario purchasing Alberta oil. And thank heavens this was the policy because we are the beneficiaries of it today. But for a period of time, we were purchasing Alberta oil for domestic reasons at a price higher than we could have purchased it for offshore. That was a national policy, and it was a good one. And we are the beneficiaries of it today, no question.
As the Prime Minister of Ontario, though, when you look at what's happened in the West, when you look at the cries of outrage, when you look at the near shave in the referendum in Quebec, are you not afraid that this country is in danger of splitting apart?
Jack, one should never ignore the concerns expressed in Western Canada, or we didn't ignore them either in Quebec and did our best to help. I think what is disturbing at the moment is that I think there is a degree of misunderstanding, about not my position, but shall we say the feelings of the people of the province of Ontario. I have to tell you, I see more Ontarians than a lot of people. There is not this antagonism towards the West. There is an appreciation and an understanding. What we have to do is find a mechanism whereby the concerns of the West are more readily understood in central Canada, and the whole issue comes down to energy. Ontario is not a participant in any energy agreement. We don't sign it. I have urged the Prime Minister of Canada, the Premier of Alberta, to sit down and see if they can't negotiate a solution. Listen, the synthetic plants out there, Coal Lake, etc., those have a very major impact on the economy of Ontario, no question. We want to see them proceed, but we aren't the negotiators.
Well, do you castigate Trudeau, though, for one, sending Lalonde as his minister to Alberta, and two, for not yet being able to come to an accommodation? Is that not really quite shameful?
Well, listen, Jack, one can throw stones, one can deal in personalities. I prefer not to. I am disappointed that there is not an agreement. No question. I would like to see an agreement. I would like to see people, listen, I guess none of us are ever totally satisfied, but I would like to see the concerns of Western Canada diminished. I don't think it serves anybody's interest to have this sort of rhetoric or this sort of debate going on.
Are you fearful of what will happen to Ontario if Lougheed does bring in his plans to cut oil production, which means that additional expenses on imported oil on the East Coast?
This will have a negative impact. The reduction of 15% in terms of available crude to the province of Ontario is something we would much prefer to do without. In actual dollar terms, the 15% reduction that would have to be replaced, part of this will have to be accommodated through the federal budget or through their federal arrangements. I think it is regrettable, and this is why I think that both parties have to see if they can't find a solution.
There is no hope of a solution, is there?
Well,
between Trudeau
Jack,
and Lougheed.
Listen, one always has to hope there is a solution. Over the years, you've had personality problems, and I'm not saying that this is the case at the moment, but Canadians have ultimately been able to find solutions. We've been able to find solutions for 113 years.
We can muddle through.
Muddling through may be one way of describing it, but we've survived for 113 years.
More with Premier Bill Davis of Ontario after the break. How many of the hardcore members of the Big Blue Machine have torn up their Conservative cards in disgust because of your support of Trudeau against Lougheed?
I don't think very many. I'll just give you one illustration.
I've been told a couple of hundred, anyway.
Yeah, I see. Well, I doubt it. I can only give you one illustration. You want to be provocative.
Yeah.
However, as a great journalist...
I hate to get bogged down in long constitutional discussions.
I understand. Well,
we know it's important, but it's almost impossible to explain.
Right. Well, let's get around to politics.
Right.
Okay. We've had a by-election since all of this happened, in the great riding of Carleton, where the Conservative candidate won with a higher percentage vote than in 75 and in 77. In fact, if a larger percentage, if one could translate those figures, it would have been one of the largest conservative wins in many decades in that great riding.
Well, you happened to run a good candidate on that occasion.
Oh, well, listen, certainly he was a good candidate.
Now, okay.
But we won it with a very good majority.
Let me try a couple of short questions, you know, for the purpose of news clips later so we don't have to distort you. How about that?
In other words, you're going to say that the total clip will be used?
More or less?
Yeah. Well, which? More or less?
Depends on the length of your answers. I used to do this.
No, it depends on the kind of question you ask.
Well, I'll keep the questions very simple.
All right.
Even though you are a prime minister, you must remember I am a poor layman looking for headlines.
I understand that, and the poor part I don't agree with.
Do you support Prime Minister Trudeau in his action right now to repatriate unilaterally the Constitution?
Ontario is in support of patriation of the Constitution. We agree with the substance of the resolution. We would prefer, like all Canadians, that it be done with unanimity. The chances of it being done with unanimity at this moment are very remote.
Have you asked Pierre Elliott Trudeau why he doesn't drop the Bill of Rights and then you could bring the whole thing back without any trouble, correct?
No, not correct, because a number of people are as concerned about, as I hear it, as not what is in the package, but what is not in the package. And I think there's some premiers of this country who would not agree, even if the Bill of Rights were to be removed, to patriation without the resource problem being solved. Now, that's my own point of view.
Is there, in fact, a resource problem, or is it not merely a taxation problem in the powers of the federal government?
Jack, I think there are two problems. One is a clarification within the Constitution of resource ownership. Ontario supports that clarification, always have. The other problem I think that the viewers would more readily understand really is the question of taxation, the distribution, and that is one of the fundamental concerns, I think.
Is it not correct that one of the real problems is that politicians across the country, including yourself, do not like the idea of an eventual referendum to break a deadlock which will really go over the heads of provincial legislatures?
I guess any practicing politician would say that they would prefer to be the ones making the recommendations and making the judgments. I have to say, as a citizen, that I have rather complete confidence in the ability of Canadians to make these judgments. I think it's fair to state that legislatures don't always reflect the point of view of the majority of the people within that province. I mean, I have to be frank about it. I am Prime Minister of the province of Ontario. We have the largest number of seats, but if you were to break it down as to the percentage of the population who in fact supported us in the last election, I can't say that I, in fact, in terms of philosophy or what have you, represent. Now, I hope that will change after the next election. But, you know, this is true in a lot of provinces.
Is it not dangerous to give a central federal government, with all its money for advertising, the right to tailor a question and manipulate it across the country, doing with it as it wills?
Well, I think, Jack, that the amending formula, some of the suggestions for changes will in fact preclude that sort of thing happening. I don't think that the people of this country, you can go through general election after general election, which in fact is a form of referendum, and say that people can in fact manipulate the attitudes and the intelligence of the people of this country.
Is it not correct, though, that do you believe that the Bill of Rights could in fact be the first step towards a U.S. Republican-type constitution?
No, I don't believe it, because the thing that distinguishes us from the American system is the fact that, and this is something Ontario has insisted on right since Bill C-60, and that is the preservation of the monarchy, the sovereign, the Queen as Queen of Canada, so that you have a system and a parliamentary system that no matter what you may or may not interpret in the Bill of Rights does not and could not lead us to a presidential or Republican system of government. It just can't happen.
How do you plead to the charges broadly made in the West that you cut Clark's throat?
Well, I would only say that if you look at the vote in the last federal election, you find the percentage change in terms of popular vote that Ontario really wasn't that much different from other parts of Canada. I'd also say to any viewer out here that the party in Ontario, myself, We worked as vigorously for Joe Clark in that February election as any other premier or any other provincial party organization anywhere in Canada.
Will you support him during the leadership review?
I made it public the other night that I will be supporting Joe Clark in February in Ottawa in the leadership review.
What do you rate the chances of Western separatism being any kind of thinkable force?
Well, Jack, I can't measure. I don't know what you mean by a thinkable force. What I think all of us should be doing is trying to develop a greater understanding, more discussions, more opportunities to reduce the potential of that becoming, in quotes, a force.
Is your career unlimited in provincial politics? Will you run again?
Is my career unlimited in provincial politics? No. I am human like yourself, and both of us have our chronological limitations.
Will you
I
run?
will run again, yes.
That was a clumsy question on my part.
Now, I hope you don't edit any of that. I mean, I think that was a good question and a good answer.
I'd like to take some phone calls.
Sure.
I tell you the truth, I'm a little bit nervous about them. Let's face it, I'm not any kind of separatist. I hate all the politicians. But you get some hairy calls after the break. With Premier Bill Davis of Ontario. Mr. Davis, I understand that you have in your bag this morning, or on the back of your Rolls Royce, a prototype of light rapid transit, which you've come here to sell to British Columbia, which needs light rapid transit badly. Is that correct?
Jack, two things I have to correct. A, you might drive a Rolls Royce. I never have, nor do I ever expect to. A, I don't have it in my bag. Sure, there have been discussions with the municipal authorities here in the Vancouver area, with the government of British Columbia. They relate to Transpo. We have a system that we think is the foremost of the world, and I say that quite genuinely. We have bids in Detroit, Los Angeles, Miami. We're building it in Hamilton. I would hope that this would serve the needs here because the thought is that a part of the manufacturing would actually be done here in British Columbia, which I think is the route we should go as between provinces.
This is light rail rapid transit.
This is a form of what we call intermediate capacity system. It is a vehicle that, in fact, runs by a linear induction motor. You understand all that phraseology. Yes. It is environmentally acceptable because there is literally no noise. It goes on wheels, but the wheels aren't driven.
You've developed this under a Crown corporation in the
Yes.
province of Ontario to take up the slack in the auto industry.
No, we started this long before the slack in the auto industry.
How much money have you put into it?
We've put, I guess, at this stage, close to $100 million in it.
And it's competitive with European systems?
We think it is not only competitive, Jack, we think it is better than
It's not yet being used anywhere in mass transit?
Not in mass transit yet, but we expect it will be in 2 or 3 places within the next 3 or 4 years.
Will you be using it in Ontario?
In Hamilton, we're already starting the engineering to put it in.
Call from Castlegar, BC to Premier Davis of Ontario. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack. Good morning, Mr. Davis.
Good morning,
my
sir.
question is in connection with that veto. I'm greatly disturbed about it. A constitution, our charter, is in place for many, many years. And if vetoes are put into operation when, based on population, which is a thing that can change and sometimes quite rapidly, I feel it is a very big mistake to stick something in which obviously cannot be removed without a fight.
Okay, Mr. Davis.
Well, sir, I'm not going to disagree with some aspects. I would only not challenge you, but suggest to you what are the alternatives. You know, Ontario has never gone to these conferences looking for a veto. That has never been our style. It's never been our approach. It happens to be that when this thing was discussed in the 60s, the early 70s, that Ontario at that point had roughly 1/3 of the population. We have always taken the position that a combination of provinces where the population figures could be somewhat comparable, this is totally acceptable to us. I'm not looking for vetoes. I don't look at constitutional reform on the basis of who gets vetoes. I'm looking for movement and change that will in fact enhance our constitutional and legal process.
Did they agree to the vetoes of Victoria in 71?
In 71, the Victoria Charter contained this in it, and it's not something that Ontario sought.
Go ahead from Winfield.
Good morning, Jack.
Good morning.
I've just listened to your show here with Mr. Davis, and there's a couple questions I'd like to put in front of him, if I may.
Yes, please.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. Davis, first off, if I may, does he feel this Constitution is necessary?
You mean bringing back the Constitution? Does he feel it's necessary at all?
Yes, first off.
Okay, point one. Point two.
Yes, and this is my own surmise. As I was an Ontarian, of course, I'm sorry I didn't vote for Mr. Davis, but I didn't understand his political convictions at the time. But the state of this country's economy and the way we're handling this Constitution ourselves, as average Canadians, I feel we must be the laughingstock of the entire world.
Two good points. One, we're the laughingstock because we make such a fuss about the Constitution, and two, why bother bringing it back at all?
Well, I'll try to deal with them one point at a time, and I want to thank the viewer who was called because he was an Ontarian who philosophically couldn't vote for me when he was there, but I sense he might have if he were back. Isn't that what the impression? Anyway.
That's the impression we got.
I'm
always looking for a vote.
I'm not just teasing.
Right.
Listen, it is not essential that the Constitution be patriated. It is not a matter of dire necessity. I just happen to believe as a Canadian that after 113 years of history, we are now sufficiently mature that we should have our Constitution within Canada, and we should be able as Canadians to deal with it. Now that is perhaps an emotional sort of response, but I happen to believe it, and I think a lot of Canadians share that much. They may not go as far as I would in terms of what is in it. The second question is, are we the laughingstock of the rest of the world? I doubt it. I think that a lot of other nations don't understand this debate. I think they don't understand the energy debate. A lot of nations, Jack, are envious of the resources of this country, our relative wealth, our relative good fortune, and I'm sure they can't understand why we're having this internal discussion. I would make one further point to your viewer. Constitutional reform, I think, is important, but I've always said at every First Minister's meeting that economic issues for a lot of people are perhaps a greater priority and that there should be more emphasis on coming together on some of the economic problems of this country.
Is Prime Minister Trudeau doing this because of his personal commitment to Quebec after the referendum when everybody promised to change the Constitution, and now the Western provinces are obviously dragging their feet in a very serious manner?
I don't think there's any question that a part of the view of the Prime Minister of Canada relates to, in fact, what was said in Quebec during the referendum. I think it is also clear that the Prime Minister of this country, for many years, believes that there should be patriation of the Constitution. It is not a new position. It is something that has been consistent.
Is he not being a little too tough on it and a little too quick?
Well, once again, Jack, you deal with individuals. We've had a lot of opportunities, whether you would say 10 years is too short a period of time, and that really, it's really been more than 10. Mm-hmm. But in my term in office, we've been dealing with it for 10 years. Is that too short of a time?
You must be sick and tired of it.
There are other issues I'd like to concentrate on.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Mr.
You see,
Davies.
I want you to say you were sick and tired of it. That would be a good clip.
Yes, I understand that.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. It's true that Ontario has got a strong manufacturing base and the like, say, but over the years, this manufacturing base really has been protected by import duties and the likes.
Tariffs and import duties, yes?
And in the West here, okay, we do export a lot in the way of wheat, raw materials, and what have you. I feel that a lot of the wealth, okay, that has been shifted around the country, that has come out of Ontario, has been because it's been protected by these imports.
Good point. Has Ontario been pampered by tariffs, whereby housewives in British Columbia have to pay fancy prices, especially for shoes and clothing, to protect 300,000 jobs in your province and that of Quebec?
Jack, I'll answer that very simply. A lot of the clothing that is being purchased, even some of the shoes, probably are from offshore, even out here. Secondly, there has been a tariff policy for Canada where other provinces have also been the beneficiary, and I would have to say to you, because you can go past clothes and shoes, a homeowner in Vancouver probably can go a few miles from here and find refrigerators, stoves, washing machines, etc., cheaper there than in Vancouver. I have to tell you, my wife, who doesn't do it, but she's my comparative shopper, she can go to Buffalo, Detroit, Cleveland, you name it, and she will find she can buy a washing machine, a fridge, a stove more cheaply than she can in the province of Ontario. The simple reality is that we have all paid a price to be a Canadian. That has been part of the history. And if one wants to argue that the solution is to have an economic union with the United States, which would solve it, I'm totally opposed to it. But Ontarians, sir, I have to tell you, have also paid more for consumer goods, in spite of all of the tariffs that I hear about, than they would have paid in the United States, because that is part of the price for having an independent country.
Last call. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Davis. Under the National Energy Program, there's been a forced reduction in the return on a depleting resource which is priced at less than 50% of world market value. Now, to follow up on the previous caller's comments, I'd just like to quote briefly from an Economic Council of Canada study by Lawrence Coppathorne.
Very briefly.
Briefly. Okay, the quote on page 81 reads, "If anyone performs the same windfall calculation exercise for the manufacturing sector as a whole, one discovers a very large residual in Ontario and Quebec manufacturing, which dwarfs the natural resource windfall." Now, Mr. Davis, how big a contribution to your province's well-being do you expect from Western and Atlantic Canada?
Well, sir, I think that you should deal with them separately. And when I say separately, you're anticipating, I assume, and I think we all hope so, significant oil reserves to be found in Atlantic Canada.
They said we must chop you, if you don't mind.
I haven't had time to... if the viewer will phone in, I will give him a long answer that is...
Mr. Davis, are you hopeful for the future of this nation, or are you, not looking at your own position, kind of politically depressed about the backbiting, fighting, and some hysteria?
Jack, I'm concerned, as all Canadians are. I don't like the backbiting, if that's the way you describe it. I don't like the rhetoric. I've been one who's tried to bring people together. But you are hopeful. But I am optimistic about the future of this country.
My thanks.
There isn't a better one around.
My thanks to Premier Davis of Ontario.